It's the Leading on Purpose podcast, helping leaders, teams, and organizations lead more intentionally, effectively, and with purpose. Well, welcome back to the podcast. Doug and I are back to continue the conversation on change leadership. So, Doug, I guess we just kind of picked things up right where we left off. But as a bit of a recap, we kind of spent the first episode, our first conversation on change, really kind of setting the table for when to make change, how to prioritize, how to be very thoughtful and choosy in terms of the changes we move forward with. And then in our most recent conversation, we began to talk about the human process, if you will, that people go through as change is implemented in the organization, the impact it has on them, some of the emotions associated with that. And so today we're going to continue that conversation because there's in fact 3 phases that we want to talk people through. And just so our listeners are kind of level set with Doug and I, we do plan to go back through these 3 phases and kind of talk you through the type of communication, the leadership approaches that work best in each of these 3 phases. But our goal, first and foremost, is to make sure we all have a firm grasp of what happens to people in these 3 phases. And so phase 1, we've already covered, which was endings. And this is really the beginning of the change process for people as they start to come to terms with mostly what's going away, what's staying the same, and how do I maybe let go of some of that. This next phase, things get pretty interesting, and it can be a dark place for people. Some change theory out there calls this middle phase the pit of despair, because that's how emotionally challenging and charging it can be to personally navigate through this area of change. But it's a place where people are really struggling. And so as we talk about these 3 phases, and maybe in your mind's eye as listeners, want you kind of thinking about this notion of a curve. And so of phase 1, we've kind of been humming along close to a line of status quo, if you will. Things are kind of, riding that line. And all of a sudden we're faced with or introduced to a major change that's going to hit us. Endings, we're still at that status quo line, kind of coming to terms with what it means, what's going away, what's staying the same. The second phase, though, things start to dip well below the status quo line. And we really start to see the impact that change can have at a team level, individual level, all the way up to certainly an organizational level. So hopefully that kind of sets the table for this middle phase. Doug, let's get into this. Let's talk through some of these emotions, the dangers, kind of, soup to nuts on this pit of despair.
What an interesting term.
Yeah.
Pit of despair.
Makes it sound hopeless, doesn't it?
Yeah, it really does. Sometimes it can feel that way.
Yeah.
I know I've experienced that when I've been in the midst of change, and particularly change as I think about it early on in my career, where I really wasn't the initiator. I was more of the recipient of this process. Now, if you take on more leadership responsibilities, you're in a little bit different position in terms of initiating the change. But yeah, that pit of despair, especially early on in my career, I can remember being there, and boy, the impact it has is significant for sure.
Yeah. You mentioned something interesting that I've actually heard people say before, which is sometimes change in this middle phase can feel like something that's being done to you.
Yep.
So it's less about the initiative, certainly less about the intended benefits to the organization or even, your department. It feels like someone woke up this morning and decided to make my life hard.
Yep.
And so it becomes a very personal experience in this middle phase. And it's not just about woe is me and emotions. There's some tangible impacts in this middle phase. And so if in your mind's eye, again, listeners, you think about this status quo line, this horizontal line that represents just our typical level of morale, of engagement, of performance, results, this middle phase, those things are all taking a hit kind of simultaneously.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the number one reasons for that in this middle phase, and Pritchett again, kind of the main organization I lean on for change research, would tell you people are getting distracted. So it's not just about the performance and results that are related to the new initiative. It's people's everyday performance that can also suffer because people are distracted. There's a lot of, again, woe is me, but then it becomes tangible when you think about how I feel getting up in the morning doing my job today. Does this pull me away from that?
Yep.
And so it's a real tough place, not just emotionally, but performance wise as well. So there's some tangible pieces to this.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think we've probably all had this experience, like you're away from the office, and in this day and age, when more and more people are actually working from home offices, it's even tougher to make this happen. But you might be in watching a show with your family in the evening. All of a sudden, you just find you're distracted by what's going on, and that happens in the workplace. You're doing your quote unquote job, and then the distraction of the change, is there for you. So it's very real. And there's also, I've experienced this personally, and you probably have as well, John, and many of our listeners. Just when change happens, it's not like somebody says, "Oh, and by the way, stop doing what you were doing." Well, we got to keep selling widgets or making calls or whatever business that you're in. So there's just, even from a time standpoint, it's like, how do you fit this in? So how often have we ever had change done to us, as you mentioned before? And it's like, I had a full-time job plus a little bit before this change. Now I've got my full-time job plus a little bit plus even more. And so I think there just needs to be an appreciation for that, especially from a leadership standpoint, that you're asking many times people to do a lot. It's doing what they've been doing, that status quo that you talked about, but what we're piling on, not just the emotion and the stress of the change, but just from a time commitment that's very real as well.
Yeah. And this will lead us a little bit into when we come back through these three phases and maybe talk about some tools and tactics leaders might
Right.
use to communicate effectively. Something you might think about that's happening for you as you're in this phase is just to come to terms with, one, this is natural. You're going to go through this middle phase. There's no avoiding it. And so, again, going back to how important this human side of change is, complemented by the process side of change. So, if you
Right.
think about the communication plans, the change management plan, the project management tools we will use, all those things that we do on that side of things, that they're very important. Got to do those things. But unfortunately, sometimes those things can lead us to believe as an organization that we can avoid this middle phase,
Right.
that we can skip from phase 1 to phase 3, immediately start realizing the gains, and off we go. So one of the first things you got to do for yourself is just appreciate, okay, I've got to sit with this for a minute and really appreciate the impact it's having on me, the stress that it's bringing, the prioritization challenges that are there, the distraction that this might be creating. It's natural and it's human. It's to be expected. The challenge is, unchecked, it's lethal.
Yep.
It can be an absolute killer of performance and productivity. And maybe for some of our listeners out there, Doug, I'll tell you, I've certainly been at this point. Sometimes this pit of despair is the last stop. We never do come back. And so what do I mean by that? Well, you ever woke up one day and looked at the office next to you or the cube next to you and said, well, what happened to Susie? Boy, when we hired Susie, she was a rock star. Boy, the last 6 months, she's just a shell of her former self. And again, I've experienced this personally. You wake up one morning, you look in the mirror and go, what happened to me? I used to be highly motivated, highly engaged, a top performer, and I'm just not at those levels anymore. I would say what's happened a fair amount of the time is we got left behind on a change at some point in this middle phase. And so again, you imagine this horizontal line of status quo, and this middle phase takes you well below that line. Well, what if that becomes the new normal for you?
Right.
Well, then what happens? Next time, yet another change is added on top of that, and down you can go in terms of your levels, again, of morale, acceptance, performance, results. So it's a big watch out for. And I think one of the easiest ways that happens is if we try to pretend that it's not going to happen, or we try to say to ourselves, this isn't happening. I just need to fall in line, or this individual should just fall in line. There shouldn't be this impact. No, A lot of this, as we talk about, again, how to handle it for yourself, is counterintuitive. And so the best way through this phase is through it. And the sooner you can get into it, the sooner you can get out of it. And the sooner you can say to yourself, this is going to hit me somehow. Let me get ahead of that and figure out what those hits, what those impacts are going to be, so I can deal with them, maybe go get the support I'll need to move through this.
Well, John, as you're describing that in this stage, and maybe I'll offer a few comments as it relates to individual going through this phase, but then also as a leader, having individuals on his or her respective team going through this phase. This phase can be very instructive to someone in terms of insight around where you are, not just about this particular change, the initiative, whatever you're dealing with, but maybe even a broader organization and its direction. And so, I do think for most folks, this exploration stage, the getting through it, what's available on the other side, what happens for folks is adjusting and accepting and hopefully embracing the change. But for some individuals, there becomes a realization that I don't support this, or I'm just thinking back when I was in a leadership role in a on the senior team, pretty good sized organization, publicly traded. It had been an organization that had been really offering a kind of a single product service line for many, many years and done it very well. And our new CEO came in, and his thought was the company needed to diversify. And candidly, I couldn't disagree with it for all kinds of reasons.
Mm-hmm.
It made sense. But John, I can't tell you the number of people on the team, and I'm thinking of a couple people in particular that worked in this organization for a long time and loved it, and then that new version of them showed up, and it was very noticeable. And I remember unsuccessfully, it was frustrating spending time with them individually, trying to help them understand why we're doing this, the opportunities it was creating for them, even in their careers. And they just weren't getting there. And one of them finally just said, "This isn't the company that I used to work for." I mean, they took great pride in the founder of the company, who was still chairman of the board, wonderful, wonderful human being, well respected. It was here in Kansas City in our community. And they just didn't respect the new CEO that came from a different organization. And they were just the heart and soul that they had so embraced in this company, they saw disappearing. And John, the reality is, unless that individual can get through that and accepting of it, there's probably not a whole lot I'm going to be able to do to them to get them to that place where they were before in terms of their motivation, their enthusiasm, their connection to the company. And in both those cases, those individuals ended up leaving the company. One
Ouch.
went and started her own business, and I think she's still doing it today. And I've long lost touch with her. I would love to have the conversation, because when she left the company, she was bitter. And there was a lot of sadness. And I would love to know how her new business venture worked out. Apparently, well, she's still doing it. And how sometimes in life, when we experience these changes, when we're in the pit of despair and it seems awful, then as you look back on your life and reframe it, it's like, wow, if in this case, this change hadn't happened that upset this person and caused her to just say, this is no longer the place for me, she never would have lived her dream. She might still be working there if the company hadn't changed and doing what she had done. So when you're in the pit of despair, it can be really hard to even have an appreciation or understanding. I'm going to look back on this experience, this exploration of this, as a positive in my life, but right now it sure doesn't feel that way. So, John, I just offer that up, whether it's a person individually or if you're in a leadership role, to understand people are going to process this differently, and there are no guarantees what the outcome's going to be. And so
Yes.
to know that sometimes, and most times, it works and it works well, but there are going to be times that somebody just can't get through this successfully. And the worst case to me is someone that can't get through it and accept it. And I think this is what you're alluding to, and they decide to stay there.
Ouch.
And
Yeah.
they are a shell of themselves, and they're not happy, and then performance becomes a concern, and that can lead to other tough conversations. So anyway, there's a lot to navigate here, both on a personal level, if it's happening to you and you're feeling it, and also on a leadership level.
Yeah. Well, what I really like about your example, your story there is, yeah, maybe that could have panned out a lot of different ways, but it ended up frankly positive. You've got
Yep.
an individual who saw that, looks back on it, saw it as a turning point to take on something new. And, you know, I know you know me well enough, Doug, to know that was my journey into the consulting world. I was in the pit of
Yep.
despair. And I think the key in both stories is you got to come to terms with it.
Yep.
And when you don't, and you continue showing up for work, well, whose fault is that? And yes, so maybe my leader should be engaging me to try to help me unpack that and be supportive. But there's a lot of personal journey in that. And I think the coming to terms with is to say, well, how do I really feel about this? Because what can't happen is I become, what we've heard so much in the last several years, a quit and stay. I stay, but I've got my arms folded and I'm not buying off on anything that's going on.
Yep.
And this can draw this pit of despair even deeper than it would have otherwise been for people, is when they say to themselves things like, well, this isn't my baby. This is not my plan. I'm going to fold my arms and say to myself, well, this is your idea, your plan. Prove it to us. Well, sadly, that whole belief set will be the very thing that undermines the success of the change. And so I think we said this in our very first conversation, setting the table for change. Buy-in usually matters more than the quality or merit of the idea itself. And so you've got to challenge yourself to a person, at the individual level, to come to terms with that and say, if I'm going to put myself on the sidelines, kind of disempower myself and say, this is your baby, this is your plan, we'll see what happens. That by itself could be the very reason that the change fails. Yep. And I don't want to get too much into this. Maybe it's another conversation for you and I, Doug. But I think raising this all the way up to the national political level, when you think about leadership at that level, if you've got half the country every time saying, that's not my plan, that's not my leader, no wonder we can't get as far as we need to in either leadership scenario.
Yeah, that's a great point.
That lack of buy-in is the very thing that can undermine the progress that's intended. And so just, something to think about, certainly at the individual level, but even beyond. Yep. So tough place here, emotionally for people. And so I think if one thing is to say to yourself, it's okay that I'm here. It's not okay that I don't talk about it or deal with it.
Right.
And so asking for help. And so real quick, some of the questions, by the way, that people will most often ask themselves in this phase, one would be, and I think we kind of explore this a little bit, but do I want to do this? Right. Whatever the change is. In my heart of hearts, is this what I want? Is this what I believe? Even if you come to terms with those pieces, then you got to ask yourself some different questions. Can I do it? That's a big one. If so, how? Is there some priorities that need to be shifted? Is there some support and development I'll need to be able to do this new thing that's being proposed? And so that's a big one to overcome, which is, do I have the capabilities to go in this direction and do things in this new way or take on this new initiative? And again, asking ourselves, what are the resources and support I'll need to be able to do it? And so one of the things that we'll talk about when we come back through these three phases and talk about leadership is having good conversations around what is that support that's needed.
Right.
Whether it's a belief struggle I'm having, capability conversation I'm having internally. There's a lot to get help on. This is not, it's a very individual experience, but it doesn't need to be an individual journey, I guess is what I would say.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like like you said before, this phase is tough and it's messy, and sometimes some really tough decisions need to be made. Either as an individual, I need to make some decisions about am I going to embrace it, but the question about can I do this? I find that to be a really interesting one. I mean, there's all kinds of directions that can head. Um, you alluded to just the amount of belief that people have in their ability to do something, and I think in this stage, one of the things that people need is support and express confidence that they can. And both you and I have been involved in it and seen organizations where they do some unbelievable things that when people first hear about, it's like, well, there's no way we can do that. And I'll tell you what, if the leadership can't wholeheartedly embrace that belief, people pick up on that. And for me personally, when I just think about my life, when I've been in that place of despair and non-belief in myself, thank God I was blessed to have people in my life that believed more in me at that moment than I believed in myself.
Huge. Yeah.
And they would see things in me that I didn't see that were there. And, right now, as I'm even saying that, they're faces of dear friends and colleagues in my life that is a great blessing that I received is that belief. And so that can be part of it. And sometimes, John, the answer to the question, can I do it, is no. And those are the ones that I think can be the most difficult to get through, both individually and for a leader involved. And I've experienced that as well, where you have a team member who's just been so dedicated and loyal, and now the role or what is needed from them has just outgrown them.
Yeah.
And I think you have an obligation to be with that person and not make a snap judgment. But my goodness, what a tough call that is when you just have to come to the conclusion this individual is not going to be able to make it. And that doesn't mean they need to leave the organization. It could be a different role or something else for them to do. But I mentioned in our last conversation, an HR organization that I took over, and the mistake that I made was thinking we were going to be best in class and case studies and all that in a short period of time. And when I got the feedback from my colleagues, you need to go just fix it because it's very broken. And we talked about being at that lowest level of operation, and my colleagues were right. And I remember a few people that were in positions that they just weren't going to be able to fix it. And, we compassionately, aligned with our values of the organization, exited those individuals from the organization. I hope they landed well on their feet and were able to find a place where they could be more successful. But all of that's part of what we're talking about, John. It's, you know, uh, fortunately, if you can implement change, and especially significant change, and not experience that, you're very fortunate. But sometimes it just comes with the territory.
Yeah. Well, so maybe as a final thought on the receiving end or human impact of this middle phase, a couple things our listeners might challenge themselves to in terms of maybe just asking yourself some questions, really ensuring you're coming to terms with where you're at in this middle phase. And I guess I would say is avoid some of these myths or beliefs. One would be, and this is really easy to develop, and we kind of alluded to this, which is this is somebody else's plan, not mine. And so that's a dangerous place to live, because at the end of the day, and this is going to sound a little harsh, but it is something to come to terms with. If I'm going to continue to work here,
Right.
it at a certain point, it's my plan too.
Yep.
This isn't your baby; it's our baby. And so, be cautious with that. If new leaders stepping in, your example, the new CEO coming in. Eventually, whatever's being proposed has to be our plan, not just their plan. Another myth, and we kind of alluded to this as well, would be I can just put my head down and keep doing my job like I've always been doing it. Another dangerous one, because if the organization is changing and going in a new direction, you probably need to be changing and going in a new direction as well. And so I would never recommend at any phase in this change process putting our head down in the sand, saying to ourselves, this isn't my plan. Or another example will be, oh, this is happening over there. It doesn't really have an impact on me. Or I'll just, not make any waves or noise and go over here and continue doing what I have always been doing, those are dangerous things to engage with. And the threat that it creates is you leave yourself behind. And it's very much an individual experience, doesn't have to be without support from others. But be careful in this phase, because the stories we can tell ourselves related to some of these myths and beliefs can be productivity killers, morale killers. I know I've been in the situation where the way I chose to handle change, I kind of prematurely soured myself on the organization. And that's nobody's fault but mine as I look back on it. And so those are things we got to watch out for in this very dark middle pit of despair.
Yep, absolutely.
All right, well let's talk about the more exciting phase here, which is, if at this point, listeners, we haven't talked you out of implementing change at all. If you've hung with us and you're like, okay, we're going to get through these first two phases, and you will. The more you're accepting of these phases have to happen to get to this third phase. You can't just jump to this. The third phase is really exciting. And again, if you imagine that horizontal status quo line, things start to emerge beyond that line in terms of people's performance, results, morale, acceptance. All of those things start to actually not only get back to where they were, but even reach new heights. Which, by the way, is the whole reason we chose to undergo the change, is to take our organization and our team members to new heights. And so once we start realizing those gains and kind of the return on investment of going through all this change, monetarily and emotionally, it's called new beginnings. And so I mentioned in our last conversation, you sitting here, well, from a project perspective, we're going to launch this on June 1st. And so on June 1st, that's the end of the change. Well, from a human perspective, it's kind of backwards. June 1st is the new beginning. We're just starting to get our arms wrapped around what this is, what it could be. And so from an emotional standpoint, what people are really experiencing in this phase is there's some glimmers of hope starting to emerge. There's some excitement. There's some quality reps on being able to show, people being able to prove to themselves, I can do this new thing the new way. There is success to be had. There is excitement about the organization's direction and future to be had in this third phase. And so it can be a really exciting phase. But I guess my recommendation, and again, we'll come back to this when we look at the leadership styles and communication that best overlay in these three phases. But for yourself, don't let your foot off the gas. Once this glimmer of hope kind of double down on your efforts towards the change, so you can start to really realize the benefits of it. And so it can be a really exciting phase. Doug, thoughts and experiences as we get into this third phase?
Yeah, absolutely. So the way you framed it, if you hung in there this long, then this is where hope and excitement can happen. Boy, my head is racing right now with several different things, maybe just one or two at this point. I loved what you said around don't take your gas or foot off the gas, and maybe two watch out for us here. So one, especially from a leadership standpoint, is you've gotten to this point, you've hit the launch date, it's out there, and then divert your attention totally to other things. And man, I've seen that mistake been made. I've been responsible for that mistake. And I think it comes from the place of check the box, done, hit the date.
Yep.
We were under budget, whatever success parameters had been determined. What is the next thing for us to take on? And sometimes there's enough momentum from the change. It can just continue to improve without attention. My experience has been that's not necessarily the case. The other thing about this phase, and it could be a real missed opportunity, is now that there's some momentum and the changes out there, whatever it is, and people are experiencing it, is how do you now start to lean into success stories? How do you create a culture in the organization where people truly feel like they do own this change. And from our operations days, John, we have seen this. Like if you have 2,000 locations around the United States, there's still probably going to be this bell curve of some that are knocking it out of the park, that middle pack that's doing okay with it, and then those that are still struggling. And in one organization that I was involved in, and we had several significant operational changes that ended up working really well. From one of the things that we have in common is our restaurant industry days, and operators are competitive. I mean, those results are posted out there, and they're competing to be up on the big stage at the annual banquet or whatever you might do to celebrate and recognize folks. And I've always I've commented on this in consulting work that I've done is I love competition. What I don't like about competition inside organization is that I'm competing against my colleagues, and I keep my success secrets to myself.
Right.
And so if in this phase you can also recognize that there's still going to be this bell curve of progress out there with around the organization, I think that you've quote unquote won when throughout your organization people are helping and supporting each other. So to me, it was just always uplifting if you had an operator, running their business, doing really, really well with this change, and it's really impacting their business positively, say within their district or their region or whatever, where they have relationships, they notice their colleagues when they get the reports that are struggling with this change is to proactively reach out to them and say, hey, I'm here for you. And I just noticed this quarter's numbers, and it doesn't appear there's been quite the traction you probably hoped for. What can I do to help support you? Now, that certainly speaks to a relationship that you have with someone versus, feeling like I'm coming in and telling you how to run your business. But when you start to notice people in this phase talking with each other, sharing ideas, and even enhancing the change that was implemented. How many times do you see that happen? The original game plan and the idea and the change is taken to an entirely different level, because now it's not leadership's change, it's ours.
Right.
We own this. And so that's where I get really juiced in this phase, John, is when you start to see those behaviors take place. And that's when you start to just skyrocket beyond the status quo and where you were before. And that's oftentimes what you want to see with these changes. To your point, it's why we have done it, is to improve whatever result that we were after. So if you can get through the other two, and it's hard work, this is where things can get real exciting for you.
Yeah. There's a mentality you have to have. And it's tough because you're coming off that deep, dark place, the pit of despair. And it's very easy to say to yourself, we survived it. Let me take this big exhale.
Yep.
And we'll try to survive the next one. And that's not what we're after here. We're really trying to, move well above the heights that we were at before and realize those gains.
Yep.
And so I think there are good signals to watch out for, as you mentioned, in terms of how actively are people seeking and sharing ideas with each other around how to parlay the success of this change.
Right.
How to realize gains in areas that weren't even part of the original game plan. And so it can be an arena or a phase of just overall excitement for people. And that's what you want to see here. And we want to foster that. And again, worst thing we can do as a leader or for ourselves in this phase is let our foot off to the gas, say, oh, we survived the pit of despair. Let me just move on to the next thing. What a waste of time it would have been to go through all this, to just arrive right back where we were before with yet one more thing on the priority list.
Yeah. And John, when organization handles this phase really well, it not only maximizes that current change and the result you would hope to see culturally, it sets the stage for that next change.
It does.
And so if you almost think about this cycle, you can think about it just the up and down here with this particular change, but knowing that's likely then going to lead into the next change. And when people have a positive experience with this, they say, wow, you know what? This worked. we're seeing results, we're proud of what we accomplished, and then, I'll make this up, 3 months later, well, here's something else. Your starting point of that next whatever it is might be different than this prior one, because people have that level of confidence, optimism, belief in themselves, in leadership, to make it happen. So I just would encourage people to know how you handle this particular change is going to have a huge impact on the next inevitable change that comes and your experience with it. So on the flip side, if you don't handle this well and you just allow the status quo to happen, or there's not much excitement and momentum, now you've created a difficult challenge for the next change that you introduce. And that's why you talk about winning in the marketplace. Organizations that master this and get really good at this just have such a huge competitive advantage on organizations that can't, in terms of the quality of change, execution, speed. They're just going to outpace everybody else when they do this well. So, we've been singularly focused on a particular change at this moment that we're working on, but I think it's important people understand there's a long game that you're playing here as well.
Yep. Yeah. And so at the personal level, let's not allow ourselves to be afraid of, well, if this goes really well and we do realize gains that were even far and, above and beyond the original game plan of this change. This can happen consciously sometimes, but I think subconsciously, where at an individual level, it's easy to kind of hold back a little bit and say, well, I don't want to prove to the organization that we can handle change, because then that's going to lead to more change. And so how do we avoid that? Well, I think at the personal level, and again, we'll come back through from a leadership perspective, how to lead through these phases. But at an individual level, if you're not getting the opportunity to do this, I think you need to push for the opportunity to debrief, provide feedback. And this is a great phase to do that, because you've kind of worked out, hopefully by this point, some of the negative emotions. You've wrapped your head around and maybe developed a more balanced perspective on the good and the bad related to this. And you've realized some gains. Well, what a great position you're in to kind of take a little bit of a look back and give some feedback. What worked well about it? What would you change next time? What has this taught you around you and your, let's say you're a leader of a team, your team's ability to take on organizational change? Don't wait for someone to come a knocking and ask that. This is a phase where we need to be very vocal and active, because it's very easy when you're in the pit of despair to be vocal, because sometimes you're pissed. But sometimes people lose sight of, well, this phase, this third phase, is also a key area for us to be very vocal. Because as you said, Doug, this sets the tone for the organization of what change overall, multiple initiatives, might look like going forth. And so what a wasted opportunity if we're not sharing just a ton of feedback, which at this point in my mind would be very balanced feedback.
Right.
So what else at the individual level here? I'm thinking about personal experiences I've had, but for you, as you arrive at this phase, anything else in terms of how it's feeling? Because I know for me, it's excitement, it's hopefulness. You mentioned the sharing of ideas and feedback with others. It feels very collaborative at times. It's like you're winning on this. Great, let me get a piece. Here's what I did. It can be a real exciting time. Any other emotion we're kind of missing from the picture here that's a good indication of this particular phase?
Well, I don't know if this is the best response, but it's kind of where my mind went to, and it's interesting that it would go there. And this is more from an organizational leadership standpoint versus individual. It's they talk about how success breeds success, and John and I, before we got on here, we always just connect a little bit and
quick wrap,
chat. Yeah. And so this will, certainly somebody listens to this on down the road, they will know the time period that we're in. But being here in Kansas City, we're in a really interesting spot right now in terms of our football team and going through the three-peat. And yesterday, I was listening to a local sports talk show, and a caller called in already talking about the four-peat. And I thought, Really? And as you were, asking the question about this phase, I couldn't help but think about that call I listened to yesterday, and what is the equivalent of that inside organizations? And so I know, like, when I have been in a leadership role in publicly traded companies who, every quarter, and John, you've worked in a publicly traded company, that quarter to quarter pressure
Yeah.
that you feel to achieve results. So I don't know if this is a watch out for or what it is about this phase, but I have remembered that pressure of, wow, what are we going to do next? Because we just lifted organization results X amount. Okay, how are you going to beat that? And so I love the challenge of that, thinking about how do we even beat our best and continue to improve. But I hadn't really thought about it before. Just some of the pressure that you feel, and even individually, that can be the case as an individual performer in the organization who's experienced some kind of change and it's lifted your performance or your team's performance. It's like, wow, how are we ever going to beat that? Now, my encouragement would be don't be intimidated by that.
Yeah.
My guess is Patrick Mahomes, when he got up this morning, well, first of all, he's not thinking about the four-peat. He's maniacally focused on what's it going to take to win this
Yeah.
game and
Or
be here in
even,
Kansas.
hey, what's practice going to look like today before we even
That's
get to the
exactly
game?
right.
Yeah.
I'll guarantee you, because they've done it so many times, they know what it takes and they trust the process. And that's another whole conversation. But let's assume that they're fortunate enough to hoist the Lombardi Trophy once again and accomplish history, and certainly the four-peat will then be there. Um, it'd be really interesting, and I think pretty predictable with him, is to know that his reaction to that isn't intimidation, but it's like it makes sense that that's what's expected. And what's it going to take to make that happen? The approach won't change, the process won't change, but the confidence in their ability to continue to perform at their best level. Now, whether or not that best level results in a four-peat, that's to be seen, and that might be a moot point here in a few weeks anyway. But I don't know if that makes sense, John. Success can be challenging to people individually and collectively as an organization, and there can be a lot of celebration and feeling good about it. How do you positively build off of that and not feel intimidated by the success and expectation that comes with it?
Yeah. Yeah. So maybe if the middle phase is, brings a lot of myths and misguided beliefs to the table around what I ought to do and how I ought to feel about things. Maybe what I'm thinking in this third phase is watching out for some of the temptations that can come with it.
Hmm.
And success does breed success, but if we're not taking the time to really unpack it and
Yep.
understand, well, what led to that success, and how do we make sure we don't get too pie in the sky, and certainly on the other end not rest on our laurels,
Right.
and continue to pay attention to the opportunities for modest improvements. And I think that's, to me, the name of the game here is, modest improvements and adjustments and changes held consistently over time. I think, research study after research study has proven will completely, consistency will completely trump intensity,
Yep.
wholesale 180-degree change.
Yep.
And there can be that temptation. You get to the top of the mountain with this big change we just underwent. Not only did we survive it, we've parlayed some of the small wins into huge wins. Don't set your sights too high. It's how can we continue this modest trend of improvement, but certainly not take our foot off the gas and just say, okay, we're
Right.
done. We don't need to do anything. Obviously, the necessity to continue to change is there for any individual and organization. And so there's just
Yep.
some temptations here that you got to play with. And maybe, as we get next, maybe into some of the leadership tactics in these three phases, in this third phase, it's at an individual level. Let's give some feedback,
Yep.
but let's also really respect what led to how we got the win.
Yep.
And what's reasonable to assume and set our sights on next.
Yes.
And so I think those types of conversations are imperative at this phase. So, All right. So what do you say, Doug? We kind of maybe walk back through. Would that make sense? And take a
Sure.
look at some of the leadership behaviors and tactics that can be used as you encounter people on your team in each of these three phases. So we'll go back to the beginning, and we covered this in the last conversation, but that first phase is endings. And this is the point at which people are first learning about what this change is, a little bit around what it will entail. And it's where that first sense of loss starts to set in because it's an ending because people are struggling to let go of what has been. And the emotional reasons for that are, well, I was good at the old way of doing things. I liked the old way of doing things. I was hired to do things the old way. And now this can seemingly feel like we're pulling the rug out from underneath folks. And so, at a very top level, the approach of leadership at this juncture in this first phase is to get information out. Get as many facts out on the table as you can. As we've said before, don't sit on information and try to perfect it. The truth will continue to be a moving target. Headlines will be changing day in and day out. This is that phase, I think, to come to terms with messy, frequent, informal communication. Get comfortable with it. Get that information out. Create spaces where people can ask questions, but it's largely an informational phase. People need to know what's changing, when's it going away, why are we doing this? It's a lot of who, what, where, when, why.
Yep.
That comes into play in this phase. And so for me, certainly some failures, some places I bumped my head from a leadership perspective in this phase is an over reliance on maybe the corporate communication structure to get this information out. And again, losing sight of that 70 to 80% rule we've talked about so many times. Again, when you think about the quality, success, and impact of change on your team, you as the leader, even if you had nothing to do with the implementation of a particular change, you own 70, 80% of that experience. And so immediately you have to think, well, if I'm relying on someone else to provide that communication, I've walked away from my responsibility to my team. And so there's an act of information gathering that has to happen here. But I know one of the mistakes I've made is, again, that reliance on, well, the memo that comes out will explain all this to everyone. I don't need to do that. No, your team's counting on you. They want to hear this information from you. So that's key. The other mistake I've made, and we alluded to this last time, is sitting on fragments of information because I'm afraid to share fragments and desiring to perfect the communication. Well, I'll wait to say anything until I know everything. Well, listeners, you might think to yourself, have you ever known everything? No, you'll never arrive at that point. And so get that information out now, as fragmented as it might feel. Your team will appreciate the time that you've given them to sit with things and to come to terms and wrestle with what's changing. And I'm big on making promises you can keep throughout the change process as a leader. And so promise people this information is going to come out fast. It's going to come out frequent. And I'm going to tell you today, and I'm going to tell you tomorrow when this information changes. I can promise you that. I can guarantee you these headlines are going to shift as this change sets in. And so it's that first opportunity for us to get in there and get extremely communicative with the team. But it's facts and information that we've got to be getting out.
Yes.
So for you, Doug, leadership successes and failures in maybe this first phase.
Well, the word that's sitting there for me in this phase, as you talk about getting that information out there, is then patience, meaning patience in the level and rate of response that you get from people, which is honoring the different ways that people will process the information, react to the information. And it's like, have you ever been in a situation where you're thinking about an idea or something you're doing, say even in your personal life, you've been sitting on it and you've gone through even in the internal dialogue in this change process, and you've gotten to that point of, I'm pumped, I'm excited. And you go share it with somebody. Say you share this idea with your best friend. Hey, I'm going to go whatever it is. And you're expecting them to go, high five, and that's great, and you rock. And the response is, really? Or no response, or whatever, whatever it is. And whatever the response is fine, because it's an indication of their initial receiving of the
Yeah.
information. So I think, if for me, I use the word patience, meaning just be patient with their response and be open to whatever the responses are, and don't immediately try to fix it. So if I'm sharing something with you, John, around this change, and there's either no response or some hesitation, don't go into that pitchy salesperson mode of, well, hey, John, maybe you didn't quite understand, but if you act, by midnight tonight, kind of
Yeah.
people, you just have to honor wherever they are. And I'll tell you that the challenging part for me during my career, and we mentioned it just briefly prior in a previous episode, is what is the overall context of this change in terms of urgency? Because if this is a change where we've got the ability to be patient and allow people, sometimes because of the state of the organization and this particular change, it's like, okay, we've got the next 30 minutes to get through the change cycle. I mean, that's an extreme, but that's tough too. And sometimes in this stage, you just have to let people know that, be patient, and set a pace
Yes.
that's needed. And as a leader, sometimes that can be really tough to do, because maybe you don't have the luxury of being as patient and as um, what's the word I'm looking for? I'll just leave it as that, as you like, because
Yeah.
there's an intensity to the change that just, it needs to happen.
Yeah. Yeah, to me, there's an opportunity here in this first phase to be a real good advocate for your team.
Sure.
And once you've gained a bit of an appreciation after you've shared it with your team of what it might entail, what they might have to go through to take this on, which is tough to predict. So don't try to, certainly we want to have a sense of our capacity and capabilities as an organization, and certainly as a leader of our team or department. But you don't really know until you kind of float the trial balloon and say, this is
Right.
this is coming out June 1st. You walk me through, team, what this is going to entail, what it's going to take. Here's some thoughts I've already come up with. Help me understand. And then once I have that understanding, it's going back to, the powers that be to advocate for my team. And again, I mentioned in our prior conversation that how soon you get people involved, how soon you start getting information out, really creates an advantage for you in terms of the quality of feedback you get back from those people. And so I found it to be true. The sooner you get people involved and start telling them around a change that's down the road, the more their feedback will sound like, well, let me give you some ideas on how this will work better. Versus if I tell you you've got 30 minutes to navigate through this, your feedback's probably going to sound like, let me tell you all the reasons this won't work at all. And so you're kind of doing the same thing in this phase as a leader in terms of advocacy. Once you have a strong sense from your team, what it's going to take, their perspective on, maybe timelines, resources, priorities, all that, honoring that, that's what's true for them, not taking it as, oh, they're lazy or they don't want to do it, or no, that's their truth. I need to go back and advocate for this in the appropriate places and say to people, hey, I've worked with my team. We've developed an understanding of what it will take. Our belief is if you said July 1st instead of June 1st, here would be the gains associated with that. Or if we were able to back burner this concurrent priority, here's the impact that would have. Or if we were able to invest in these extra resources, June 1st starts sounding pretty good. So you could even imagine in this phase, after you've gathered some information from your team, coming back with some options for leadership on, hey, I've got some ideas on how this could work even better.
Yep.
Here's the risks if we just trudge forward as currently designed, though. And so there's a form of advocacy that has to happen there. The other version of advocacy is just the information itself, is getting out there and asking the questions to which your team needs the answers. And don't guess too much on that as leaders. I think certainly gathering whatever you can and passing that through to your team is important. But I've also made the mistake of bringing forth the wrong information to the team, information that wasn't as interesting to them, wasn't as important to them. And so I think there's a balance there. Hey, let me share with you what I have learned, today's headlines. What pieces of information are most important to you, team, that you want me to go ask questions about? I don't want to guess what that is. You tell me, and then I'll go advocate. I'll go pursue those pieces of information. And so I think there's a big piece of advocacy that has to happen that you'll see will carry through the other two phases, but it starts right here as
Yep.
we're gathering information and getting a sense from our teams what it's going to take to get through this.
As you were mentioning before, the don't totally rely on the corporate communications department. And again, depending on the size of the organization you're in, you may be sitting there going, "What corporate communications department?" That would be me, and I'm IT, and I'm whatever it might be. And I certainly corporate communications departments are important in larger organizations. I worked with some great colleagues in those areas, and their role in change is so important. And their messaging tends to be at a very high level. And so, John, what I'm hearing you talk about is, as a leader, it's making sure that people on our respective teams understand the connection to them. And sometimes I think senior leaders will look at a change, and to them it's intuitive about how this trickles. Well, here's the benefits throughout the organization, and sometimes it's fairly clear, but many times it's not. And so I think this information providing that you're talking about is so important, not just reiterating the major headlines and talking points that have already been published, but getting more into the weeds and that personal impact about what this is going to mean for them.
Yep.
Really important.
Yep. Couple other things to think about in this phase as a leader. One, we mentioned, at the individual level, how easy it is, certainly in the pit of despair, but even in this first phase, to develop that belief that, oh, this is their plan. Well, to me, over dependence or reliance on the corporate communication structure as a leader to get my team the information they need would be the leadership version of that very same myth. Well, this is their plan. They'll update you. I don't know what's going on. I don't know if it's going to work. And I don't know if this is the right term. I kind of call it passerby leadership. I kind of fold my arms as the leader, try to step out of the way and instruct my team. Well, we'll just see what comes out in the normal memo communication process of the organization. One of the things we have to appreciate, a lack of leadership is also a version of leadership to your team.
Yep.
And so for me to say, I don't know, the CEO thought of this, I'm sure some stuff will come out. You'll know when I know. Your team's probably sitting there going, okay, to your face, but behind closed doors, what was that?
Right.
Thanks a lot. And so there's a level of ownership that has to come into play here, as we've said so many times with our leadership. Own the change. Definitely if it's your implementation, but certainly even if it's not, we got to have that level of ownership, because that's what our team is counting on and looking for. And that's what's going to have the highest degree of impact on their buy-in, which, by the way, that's what our leadership is trying to do here. It's really twofold, I would say, if I was to boil down everything you're trying to do as a leader through change. One, how do I, through my leadership style and communication, minimize distraction? Not allow this change to pull you away from the things that you're good at, continuing to produce widgets, take care of customers, whatever it is. I can't allow distraction to be a part of this change. And so I've got to communicate with you. I've got to maintain expectations on things that should continue happening. So we don't just stop what we're doing when a change is implemented and take on the change. There's other things that have to continue happening. So I think on the one hand, it's distraction mitigation is what you're after here. But from a maybe more inspirational leadership perspective, I'm trying to generate buy-in from you on how this will and can impact you and improve our performance as an organization, as a department. And so those are two things I think that have to start in this first phase that are the core of what you're trying to do as a leader: minimize distraction and increase the level of buy-in, because that's what's going to lead to success of the change. And so couple of big kind of top level pieces.
Yep. John, before, and I don't know if this would be a good transition or not, I mentioned the word be patient.
Yeah.
Regarding the response. The other word I was considering, and I held off on it, was also be vulnerable, and vulnerable in terms of just even your own personal commentary or reservations or struggles. And when I think about the three phases of moving from the endings to exploration, it's not this nice, clean, okay, a week from Tuesday, we'll be entering the exploration stage. I mean, it's this,
set a date for it.
Yeah. And when I think about vulnerability, the reason I was hesitant to share it in the first phase, although there's certainly a place for it, I think there's a bit of once you're working with your team is a bit of reading the room, if you will, in terms of the team.
Certainly.
And so as the idea is out there, as you've provided the information, as you're being patient in the response, is to start to get a sense of, as they're moving into that exploration stage, how is this landing with them, either collectively as a group, individually? Chances are pretty good you're going to have not everybody on the same page. They're going to be in different places. And especially for those folks that are struggling with it, but even folks that have really, really embraced it, that's then from a leadership standpoint, I could feel more comfortable, if you will, expressing even some of my initial thoughts and reaction to this idea when it was brought to my attention. To lead with that as you announce the organizational change and give them this information to immediately have in there. And let me tell you what my concerns are with this change. You could do it very professionally in a way that honors the change and doesn't speak poorly of the organization, but you've already started to get people thinking, it's like, well, I hadn't thought about that. My boss is up there expressing that concern. So, John, I've always found in this process, the more intentional you can be, if you are going to be that candid and share concerns, is to ask yourself to what end? How is this going to be helpful? There could be some situations you just keep that to yourself,
right?
Because you're reading the room, you're reading the team. In general, they seem to get it. They're curious about it. They want to explore it more deeply. But generally, I think we're headed in a positive direction. For me to wallow and tell them, well, let me tell you, the first time this was brought up in the meeting I was in, we almost killed each other. We did, but it's like, okay, you might have fun telling the story, but there's no value to them.
Yep.
You work through it at your level of the organization. Now allow them to process it the way it's going to be. But know that at times it can help people get through this if you're willing to be vulnerable and real with them about some of the concerns you had and how you personally have worked through those.
Yeah. Yeah, and what a mistake to make as a leader in general. We talked a lot in our episodes and conversations around the notion of climate. Here it is, we're starting to see a bit of sunshine, the team is, and then you come in and create some rain clouds. Yep. It's like, what?
Yep.
So you do need to read the room. One of the other things I think about is what do you keep to yourself? What's the appropriate level of vulnerability and candor with the team? Like you, Doug, I've always been a big fan of don't assume you can play poker with your team. Don't hide from your emotions, because people who have worked with you long enough and know you well enough are going to read right through that. And in fact, you'll create some distance and lack of trust if you try to sell something, really pitch it, and not really tie to that where your constructive thoughts are, your balanced thoughts on what works, what doesn't work about this change. They're going to see right through that if you're not careful, and it could have some down the line impacts on your relationship with the team. And so maybe a way to think about how to manage some of these things, because let's be honest, you're both the individual that we talked about earlier going through this phase and these three pieces of the change curve, and you're leading others through it. So it can be a really challenging place to go, in particular, if you're not the implementer of the change, right? if you're not the CEO, oftentimes you are forced to navigate this sometimes simultaneously, or maybe a day or a week before your team is expecting to be led through it. And so that can be really challenging. And so we've alluded to this a bit, but maybe, a big part of this is appreciating that I myself am likely not in the exact same place my team is in terms of these three phases, which creates challenges. Because one of the things that's absolutely true is human nature for us is to communicate from where we're at, not where the people on the receiving end are at. And so if you're in the pit of despair as the leader, and I'm just starting to share some information and facts, we'll appreciate how that may taint the message you're sending when these people are just trying to learn about what's going on. Imagine you're up in inspirations. You're pumped. You're excited. You saw the light. You're starting to get traction on this new thing. And the team's just getting into that pit of despair. Your pitch, your tone as the leader can be really off. And so what we're not saying is to hide from how you feel or hide from where you're at. You've got to share that, but appreciate maybe where the people on the receiving end are. The other piece of that is, again, because this is such an individual experience, individuals on the same team at the same level in the same organization could be in different phases.
Right.
What if you got a member of your team that just is predisposed to being an early adopter, or they were involved, with the project team? Well, their place on the change curve is going to be very different than the individual that is just finding out today what exactly is happening. And so at any given point, not only you versus your team, but individuals within that team could very likely be in different places and thus need different things from you simultaneously. And so this gets really messy and really roller coastery as you think about that, plus the fact we're not taking things one at a time. There's multiple changes hitting us all at once.
Right.
And so
Absolutely.
It's pretty convoluted and potentially overwhelming. But I think some simple tactics in this first phase, again, the quality of your communication, the honesty behind it, the idea that, boy, I've got to get information out as soon as I get it. And I've got to advocate for my team. I've got to gain a sense of what this change is going to take and what information will be most helpful. And then I've got to go work on those things on my team's behalf. And then maybe as a last thought, there's a high dose of empathy as a leader, particularly in these first two phases.
Yes.
And so it is next to impossible to predict what the sense of loss will feel like to someone. And so just know that you should anticipate something. But as you step into this, you start sharing it, be ready, wherever people are at with it is going to need to be just fine. And so there's, again, a counterintuitive side of this as the leader, an irony almost, that not only is the only way through it, as you think about stepping through this phase and getting into the pit of despair, but the sooner we can get there, the sooner we can get the cards on the table, the sooner we can talk about, not only what's great, but what maybe stinks about this idea, what's going to be difficult, the sooner we begin to start navigating through it. And so that's a bit around the leadership approach and the communication that works most effectively in this first phase.
Yep.
All right, back to the middle here. This dark pit of despair. Tough place, high doses of empathy. You've got members of the team that when they're in this phase again, are really struggling emotionally, likely struggling in terms of their overall engagement in the organization, likely struggling in terms of their own performance. We got potentially some distractions taking hold. And again, as a reminder, there's nothing you can do to skip this phase. But I do want to tell you, if you do some of these leadership tactics, if you embody some of these communication approaches well, you can influence what's called the breadth and depth of this pit of despair. How low does it go and how long does it last? And in our examples of leaving people behind, do we ever get out of it? You do have an influence over that as a leader, and it all, again, comes from your level of leadership and communication you're providing the team. And so, Doug, some things you've seen in this middle phase when you've really got a member of the team that's, boy, at the very bottom. Certainly empathy comes into play. What else?
Well, For sure, empathy. That was the one that was most on my mind. And John, I go back to some of our prior conversations around coaching, and there's so much of what good coaching is about that applies at this stage, and it's to be curious around where people are, and that's a big part, I think, of empathy, is to truly come. I just wanted, John, where are you right now? How is it? How is it for you? And then listening, and we've mentioned Stephen Covey here recently, and in our conversation around listening to just simply understand where somebody is, not to be understood. And so those two things, the empathy and that kind of empathic listening with others, is so important. I mentioned a few minutes ago, this is when even expressing your own thoughts around it can be very very helpful to someone. And I think the final thing I would suggest, because as we use this term pit of despair, is in all of this, is to also be realistically optimistic. And so go to where people are. And if it's in a not very good place, be willing to meet them where they are.
Yeah.
And then within the context of the conversation and your interaction with the person, is to hold up that sense of hope that, this is going to be a challenge. It was kind of like, I don't know if this is a good example, way back in the day when Kennedy announced, landing on the moon, and part of that very inspiring speech that he gave is, we do this not because it's easy, but because it's hard.
Yeah.
And there's a lot to be gained from this journey. And so I'm not putting the pressure on folks to be Kennedy-esque in these moments.
That's good news for folks.
Yeah. Well, but I do think people need that sense of hope, and they need to have a leader show up in a way acknowledging the challenges, the difficulties, and acknowledging the personal struggles that someone may be having at that moment, but also expressing a belief and hope that this is possible and we're going to get through it. So it can be draining as a leader to need to do that. And I know for me, if you're not mindful and intentional about it, you can get kind of caught up in that yourself. It's there's an old Saturday Night Live skit, the Debbie Downer character, and she just, people at the party or the lunch or whatever, just and sometimes I can think about being around team members, either as a leader or as peers, and maybe I was pretty pumped up about it, but the more you listen to them, it can kind of get contagious, and it can kind of start to weigh you down. And that's fine. What's not fine is if you're in a leadership role, to allow that to kind of creep into your presence and your language and your talking. So go to where they are, but also be very mindful of not allowing it to get in the way of your optimism and your hope about that particular change. I think that's important as well.
Yeah. The first step, I think, with this phase as the leader, and what individuals on your team are likely looking for, first and foremost, is be okay that I have to go here. The sooner you can make it okay for me to not feel great about this change, to struggle with it, to go through some challenges, the irony is the sooner I start feeling better around my path out. If I'm in the bottom of the pit of despair. The other thing you mentioned is that, the whole Debbie Downer and how contagious that can be. You need to appreciate as a leader, if I'm not willing to step in and meet people where they are at the bottom of the pit of despair, those conversations are going to happen without me then. And so you have to ask yourself, if I'm not facilitating, a conversation around what stinks, what's the struggles, what's going to be hard about this, how do we find our way out, and I shut it down, and I'm that leader that's coming in as the used car salesperson and saying, it's the best thing since sliced bread, you need to fall in line, there shouldn't be anything wrong, and I basically shut down any opportunity to share pushback, struggles, feedback, any of that, the Debbie Downer conversation is what's going to happen over at the coffee maker as your team finds ways to talk about it anyways. And if you're not there to facilitate a more balanced conversation that has a dose of that hope, that has a balance of here's the struggles, but here's what's exciting potentially about this. Here's where it's intended to go. Maybe that visionary aspect of this. It's going to go downhill pretty fast. And you and I have both read some materials, call it the downward spiral conversation. How contagious and how fast and how low. You talk about dragging the pit of despair down. That's what happens. And so that's maybe for you as a leader, what's at risk here if you don't entertain these conversations. But it can sound counterintuitive. It's like, you mean to tell me I'm going to gather my team in a room and create a space where they can tell me what's terrible about this idea, what the challenges are going to be? Yeah. Because they're going to find ways to talk about that anyways. So it might as well be in a venue where we can process it together, where maybe I can tell some stories. Because by the way, storytelling is a great version of leadership during this phase of what you've experienced with this, other changes you've been through, and what happened in those circumstances. Powerful version of leadership in this phase. But I guess first and foremost, we got to make it okay that people are going to end up here, and make it okay to talk about it.
Well, and John, when like you described, maybe instead of individually talking with your team, it's as a group, and when those moments happen, the encouragements, it's okay and it's healthy and it's good to talk about these concerns. Is that when that starts to happen, be very aware of your response to when they bring these concerns up. Because if the pattern becomes, well, I'm concerned about X, and your response is, well, let me tell you, we've thought about it and this is good. And I'm also concerned about Y. Well, we've thought about that too. And I'm not saying you don't ever respond that way, because in that moment, that could be very reassuring to folks, saying, well, they have given this some thought and those are legit. But it's a lot of times I have found they're going to come up with concerns and issues you haven't even thought about.
Yeah.
And so first of all, say thank you. That is a great insight. And especially if it was something tough to say, and it took courage, acknowledge that, say that, to speak that out loud, and that level of concern or that particular issue is really important. And thank you for that. 2, don't feel like you as a leader need to have an immediate response or solution to it.
Exactly.
And acknowledge it. And now here's where I think from a trust and credibility standpoint, it's important. Let's say that they ask a great question or have a huge concern. I don't have a good answer. And I'm thinking to my, in the conversation I'm having in my head is, oh, crap. That's a great point. Is note it, thank them, and then commit to following up.
Yes.
And closing the loop. How often will you see leaders have these kind of meetings and go, well, that's not, and they'll even make the list and they'll put the flip chart up and, okay, here are the big concerns. And then nothing. Bupkis. Come back into the conversations with that same list and say, you know what? You had, as a team, you had 6 things that were of concern. I'm here today to tell you 2 of these items, I think I've got some information that will be helpful. The other 4, I don't.
Yeah.
But I want to let you know I haven't lost track of them. So it's how you respond in the moments, not just the encouragement that you're talking about, but the follow-up, the thank you, the reinforcing of it.
Yep.
And keep in mind, it's during these times, there may be some insights that come up that hadn't been thought about. Maybe the reason those 4 things that they pushed back on or had questions on were some of those oh crap moments when you took it back to your colleagues and you're like, geez, I hadn't even thought about that. We need to spend some time on that. And you can even say that to the team. Say, those 4 things you brought up, what I just said. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Because as much as people had looked at this, changed, and planned it, those are some things that were missed. And unless you'd had the courage to say that, we would have continued to miss it. So thank you. And it's going to take a hot minute to figure it out. John, this could even be a chance of, would you help us figure it out? Would you be willing to come to the table and express to some other folks these same concerns and any ideas that you would have to address it? So it's be open to whatever is happening, but from an integrity standpoint, from a trust standpoint, not only just listen, but be sure to follow up and take action.
Such a powerful aspect of all this, Doug, just as a leader in general, even outside the change process or model, this idea of how you receive feedback, huge for a leader. Yep. And the the story that's coming to mind, this was an opportunity you and I had several years ago where we co-facilitated an experience with a team. And I don't know if you remember the story, but we were working with a group of leaders, providing some coaching, some one-to-one coaching, and we had a couple facilitated touch points with the group as a whole. And I don't know if you remember, you and I were comparing notes on how some of the individual conversations were going, and some themes emerged in terms of some real challenges people were having with the leadership
Right.
being provided and the organization's direction and the amount of change, not so ironically, that the organization was taking on. And I remember feeling really good through most of this project because you and I were able to, I think, convince some members of senior leadership to create an open ear for some of these concerns to emerge. And I even remember the setting. We set ourselves up to have a nice environment. We invited what I think was a handful of leaders, maybe a dozen or so, and really set the table for a great conversation to happen and some of this feedback to be shared with a particular leader in the organization who joined us that day. And I don't know if you remember, but each of these dozen leaders, we went around the horn and they each shared their very specific concerns and how it was impacting them. And it was articulate, it was heartfelt, really pitch perfect. And I remember sitting there, you and I were there, and the leader of this group was there, obviously. And I remember the leader of this entire group, I look over a couple times and wasn't saying a word, feverishly taking notes. And I'm thinking to myself, this is awesome. This is absolutely perfect. Each person sharing this feedback, this individual's silently sitting there taking notes. We got all the way around the horn. Last person shares their feedback. And I'm sitting there going, I'm ready to high five you. I'm like, this is a great idea. This worked. And then it all unraveled in about 10 minutes. And what proceeded to happen was the leader was taking notes so that they could go back around the horn and do exactly what you just recommended a leader doesn't do, which is provide an explanation for why that particular concern shouldn't be a concern.
Yep.
And why there was an answer to all the problems that had been shared. And to me, I'd have to think really hard on this, but it's likely one of the most tone deaf situations I've ever been in. And like we've always said, was it from a place of ill intent? No. This individual really felt compelled to provide thoughtful explanations for these people's concerns, thought they were doing absolutely the right thing. Well, Doug and I were there. We saw the impact it had on the room, which is, I honestly think you had some people walk away from that room saying to themselves, I will never, ever share detailed feedback around how I feel around the direction of this organization ever again.
Yep.
And I'd have to go back through and track, did all those people stay with the organization? I don't know where the story actually ended up, but what we experienced in that room was one of the worst examples, most prime examples of what we're just talking about here. And so, Doug, I don't know if you remember that experience, but it's,
well,
you could feel the impact.
I do now, John, but I also remember what it felt like. So I had worked for years to block that from my memory, and maybe with a little,
we'll get you back into therapy.
Yeah, a little bit of therapy, I'd blocked it out. So now it's there again for
Send me the bill.
But, yeah, no, it's. Yeah, I do remember it, and I appreciate the fact you said this leader had no ill intent, and I feel confident that they didn't. And in fact, they may have walked away from the meeting thinking, "Wow, I handled that well. I had an answer to all their concerns. I maintained my credibility. I defended decisions by leadership, and that's what my job is. And I'm so glad and I can't even remember what feedback was offered to the person, if any. But isn't that interesting how somebody can walk away from something like that? And on a side note, if somebody doesn't have the ability or the courage, frankly, to give that leader feedback, the meeting after the meeting saying, can I offer you just what I observed that happened in that meeting? Because without that feedback, the next time that leader is faced with a similar situation, that's exactly how he or she is going to respond to it. So unfortunately, it happens, and through no ill intent, but boy, does it have a lasting impact. That's for sure.
Yeah. And so when you're in those moments, there's another temptation here to resist, which is maybe you do have right at the tip of
Right.
your tongue a worthwhile explanation.
Yep.
It's what's the tone? Read the room, as you said, Doug, and appreciate that's not where this group is at. They're not ready for an explanation. What would land best now is gratitude for their
Yep.
courage in sharing maybe what was probably some tough feedback to share. That's got to be the takeaway today because they're not
Yep.
going to hear my explanation. If this is how frustrated they are, this is how low in the pit of despair they are currently, worst thing I can do is paint such a clear picture of my disconnect and how maybe I'm standing at the top of new beginnings looking down at them with this almost insistence that my explanation is going to be exactly what they need to get to where I'm at. And as we said, nothing could be more tone deaf than not appreciating, boy, maybe there is an explanation. Maybe it's a really good one, but now is not the time. And
Yep.
it's oftentimes that follow up step where maybe you share some of those insights and also honor some of the things that you learned, in the feedback that didn't occur to you that you didn't have an explanation for.
Yep.
And so how you field those concerns, critical, during this process. And it's another example to me of the ultimate balance of accountability and empathy. Certainly there's accountability with all this, which is that the organization has made investments here. We've made the decision. We're going in this direction. We really want and need each and every one of you to be a part of it. And not but, and we have a strong appreciation for we're just not there yet. And there's some stuff we're going to need to go through to navigate and get to
Yep.
realizing any gains that might come of this change. Now, you mentioned earlier the coaching side of this, which brings some other temptations that you got to watch out for as you're in this pit of despair. And so we mentioned one, which is, coaching is not talking people out of how they feel. It's meeting them where they're at and being okay with the fact that they aren't where you're at. They're struggling with some things that may not have even occurred to you. And so the worst thing you can do is provide a solution and tell them, talk them right out of how they're feeling. That would be the opposite of coaching here. The other piece of coaching and this notion, again, of meeting them where they are, and I mentioned it earlier, is making sure you're not coming from a place of insistence that, hey, I've arrived on this change. I'm there. What's your problem?
Mm.
No, I got to step down back into that pit of despair and to whatever degree possible, feel what you're feeling. Go back to where I was when I was in the pit of despair with this particular change and be able to really connect with you in that way as I'm coaching you through this. The other aspect of the coaching that rings true for me in this phase as well is there can be this desire, again, out of good intent, when you see someone at such a low to save them. I want to help you out of this. I'll get you out of this. Well, if you listen to anything we've talked about in terms of coaching, coaching is inspiring someone, challenging them to think their own way forward. Certainly, there are support and resources that you need to have, but that needs to come from them. And so they've got to kind of be the author of this path out of the pit of despair with your support. And so that's the way you want to think about, maybe facilitating some of these conversations. And so I'm imagining there's a group setting here where maybe we get the cards on the table, we talk about challenges. We get real honest and frank about where we're at with this change. And then maybe as a follow-up, there's these one-to-one coaching conversations to appreciate, hey, each individual's in a bit of a different place, likely in the pit of despair for some maybe different reasons, and certainly possessing a different pathway out. Well, that's where the coaching can come into play to really get with each individual to say, let me help you author your own plan out of this. And so, yeah, coaching to me couldn't be more appropriate than it is in this middle phase. The key word that Pritchett really uses, and this overlays well with coaching, is support.
Yep.
Support me in the fact that I need to go here. Support me in the challenges I'm going to face, empathize with those. Support me with the training and resources I might need to get out of this. And so there's a lot of support being offered in this particular phase. And if you can do that well, you stand the greatest chance, I think, of influencing breadth and depth, how low it goes, how long it lasts. But we're not going to avoid this phase altogether, no matter what you do.
Yep. John, just from a tactical standpoint, one other thing I would would offer up too, that's a bit of self-care as a leader, because this is a very challenging phase as you're working with your team, is also, well, I can think of some individuals I did this with over the years in the midst of this kind of change. Who can I talk to? A colleague that's also leading a team, and just over lunch or a beer at the end of the day or whatever, just say, "How's it going with your team? What are you hearing, and how's that for you?" And so, um, you don't need to do this alone with your teams. Take care of yourself, because it can take a toll. It can be exhausting, and those conversations with your colleagues can be really helpful in terms of your interaction with your team. So if I'm talking to a colleague and saying, "Hey, this is what I've been experiencing, what I'm hearing. Here's some things that we tried." There may be some ideas there that are very helpful to you with your team. The two of you may hear some themes that are going on between your respective teams. And it's like, well, if you and I are hearing these things or experiencing it with our team, I wonder how broad that is through the organization. And so, as a leadership team across the organization, if you can stay connected and share those insights, that can be helpful as well. I've been involved in situations where, as we grouped as a leadership team and debriefed about how's it going with your teams, we learned some things from that process that can then be leveraged more organizational wide. If you've got 10 departments in your organization and 8 of them are saying everybody's asking about X and Y. Well, apparently we did a crap job as an organization, whether it be the big communications plan or message points as we go down into the organization. So we need to do a better job as a leadership team. So you don't have to go it alone. If nothing else, lean into your colleagues for help and support for yourself during this time as well.
Yeah, maybe along with that, appreciate just the power it has at an individual level for people to know they're not alone and how they're
Absolutely.
feeling. That all by itself sometimes is a source of hope and inspiration to know there's other people facing these same challenges.
Yep.
Now some of that exciting sharing and gathering of ideas can maybe even start in the pit of despair and become the pathway out.
Yep.
And so that's where some of that could actually start. So, well, Doug, I think that's as good a place as any to maybe pause the conversation. And I say pause because there's more to dig into as we think about the leadership and communication provided in the third phase. But also, I think some top level ideas and tactics you and I want to tackle around just leadership and change principles that apply across the board, across all 3 phases, and some other final thoughts on this whole change leadership arena. But great conversation. And tune in next time as Doug and I put a kind of pin in the third phase of the change curve in terms of the leadership and communication to be provided there, and some other top level thoughts and ideas around effective change leadership. Thanks so much for tuning in. Don't forget to like and subscribe.